Okay guys, we're going to have a quick review of the stereo field, what it is and how we can control it. So in its essence, the stereo field is the spread from left to right of our sounds and also either the center or the sides. And we're trying to at least roughly replicate what it would sound like to have a real band or a real array of instruments in front of us in this real room, aka the 4D mixing space. So here we can see a picture of a real orchestra in a real orchestra hall. Imagine you are where the conductor is standing, except you'd be facing the orchestra. You can see there are all the violins in one area, all the cellos, all the basses, you've got all the horns at the back, you've got the percussion at the back on the left slightly, you've got the harp over on the left and some kind of piano as well it looks like. And if we look at the 4D mixing space diagram again, you can see that's what we're trying to achieve. Now the reason we haven't looked into it that much yet is because, as I mentioned right near the beginning of the course, getting those first three dimensions working well first, aka the frequency, the depth and the time, is most important, and the stereo can be a distraction, especially if we've got these awesome big synth pads and whatnot that just sound really cool, but when you listen to them in mono they can sound muddy and cluttered. But we're much further through the process now, and where stereo was our enemy because it can confuse our ears, it's now our friend because it can excite our ears. Think of it like cooking. Stereo are the spices at the end that turn a pretty good solid meal into this amazing feast that makes the difference between a good chef and like a gourmet chef. There are a few other spices that we're going to add to our mix as well, but one of them is definitely getting a handle on this stereo field. So a quick review of the four tools at our disposal. We've got panning, we've got reverb, we've got delay, and we've got stereo width. And we've already gone through all of these. In the Ninja Mixing Tips module after this, I'm going to show you some pretty cool ways that you can add even more stereo width. But for now, we've got everything we need to progress our mix. So the question I get asked a lot is what goes where in the stereo field? Is there a tried and tested placement for different elements in our mix? Well, yes and no. Some elements should always be placed in the center in every mix, but some elements it's going to depend on the song and what's required, and I'll just explain to you and give you quick examples of why this is the case. So the center of our mixing space, as we can see for our plan for this song, is to have the lead vocals in the middle, in the center. Now this is almost always the way. It's going to bleed out to the sides slightly when we're adding our reverb and a bit of delay, but the main body of it comes from the center of the mix. This is because it's one of the most important elements. The same can also be said for the kick and for the low and the sub bass. So that's pretty much any bass below about 130 Hertz or so. And this is for the two reasons that, one, you want it to sound like it's central and powerful because they're the most important elements of the mix along with the vocals, and we don't want to be having those phase issues that we looked at earlier when translating onto a mono system. You might also have your lead synth in the center and also your main clap or snare. But if we look at what we would usually place on the sides, you'll see that that's not always the case. So the backing vocals will almost always go on the sides because we want them back in the mix. And if you just imagine the backing singers standing either side, a few feet back from the lead singer on a stage, that's why we put the backing vocals where we do. Now, if you have a lead synth that you want to sound really wide, which can sometimes be the case, then you might add a stereo widener and have a lot of information out to the left and to the right. But you wouldn't pan it either one way or the other. It would be in the center, but very wide, if that makes sense. This is the difference. This is a mono synth. This is a left pan synth. This is a right pan synth. And this is a wide synth with a lot of information on the left and right. Now hi-hats and percussion, these are elements that are quite interesting to bounce around to the left and the right. We can use panning for that, or we can use a bit of stereo width. Something called the Haas effect is very good for this, and check out the Ninja Mixing Tip lesson for more information on that. You might want to have your mid and upper bass sounds out to the side. Again, as with the lead synth, you wouldn't have these panned either left or right. You just have them wider but equally balanced onto the left and right. and other supporting elements like pianos and pads and things further back in the mix. These can all be panned slightly to the left and the right, and they can have a lot of stereo width added to them. And reverbs are especially good for making your mix really wide. And I can't think of any situation where you'd have a reverb in mono. They would almost always be stereo, because the whole point of them is to trick your ears into thinking that you are looking at this three-dimensional space. So let's apply some of this to our mix. So I have zoomed out a bit so we can see more tracks. So it's a bit smaller, but we can then see more on the screen. So let's loop the busiest section and have a listen to it. Okay, so we have our kick drum central, we have our sub bass central, and our mid and high basses panned out to the left and the right a bit to give it some width. And if you remember, we also added this bass reverb to give it even more width. But everything below about 130 Hz is in mono. We've got our lead vocals. Again, central. You can hear some slight reverb that we added earlier, and that just sits it in the space nicely, but predominantly it's in the center. Our backing vocals panned either side, making the whole vocal track nice and wide. Now the piano doesn't need to be central really, but it's quite an important element in this song, so I've kept it central and we've just kind of panned it left and right with the delay. Just so there's some information bouncing around out in the sides to make it nice and wide. Now the drums, this is where we've got a lot of scope for panning things left and right. So let's go through in order. Remember, we've got the levels how we like them, we've got the frequencies how we like them. Now we're just working on the stereo width. We've got our main clap central with a bit of width from the room reverb. Now we might pan the open hat slightly to the left. And you can always switch back to mono and make sure it still sounds the same in mono, and it should do. That's central, and that's panned. Let's listen in stereo. And then we can have the closed hat. Now they've already got a lot of stereo information going on, because I would have applied an auto panner in the music production stage. So we don't need to do anything with those. Rim shot. Now we made this nice and wide using that Haas effect. So it's still in the middle, but it's spread out to the sides. So we've got these snare intros. So that's an ideal example where you can add some interest to your mix by having these pan. So let's add an auto panner on here. We're just going to use the Ableton Live stock auto panner, but Sound Toys make a great one called Pan Man, which you can use as well. And let's just loop it and have a listen. Now you can automate the panning, but if you are, I would recommend automating it with a plugin rather than on the actual mixer channel, for the same reason that we don't automate the volume on the mixing channel. If we want to move the whole channel slightly to the left or slightly to the right, if we've already automated it, that's going to make it very difficult. Just check it in mono. Now it loses a bit of volume for some reason there. So let's just up the volume a bit. We'll group them so we can do a proper comparison. Great, in stereo. So now let's listen to that snare intro in the mix. So that makes it nice and interesting, keeps the ears interested. And now we've got this cowbell loop, which already is quite wide. If we put a isotope imager on it, you'll see that there's a lot of information in those, in the stereo field. Look how wide that is. If it was mono, that would be a straight line like this. Listen to the difference that makes. So that's already nice and wide. And the triangle, again nice and wide. We've already got it panned slightly to the left, and we've got a little bit of room reverb which gives it more width. And the cymbal, again, I like to have these hit in the middle, but have the reverb spread them out to the sides, and any delay as well. Have a nice wide ping pong delay, just to add interest. Now I would say don't be afraid of using a lot of panning movement or stereo field automation even when it comes to the elements further back in the mix. It's probably not something you want to do so much on those core elements, but if you listen to some of your favorite music, you will notice that it's all these little details, all these little pans, these little plays with stereo width and converting to mono or panning from left to right over time that just give more life to the music. So experiment with auto panners and stereo wideners, but just make sure that those core elements are settled well into the middle of the mix, and all that ear candy you can do with things like risers and hi-hats and atmosphere sounds and little vocal chops and things like that. And that is how we place elements of our mix in the stereo field. The next stage is to look at bus processing, and this is exciting because this really is where you can take your song from the 80-85% of a quality mix that we've got at the moment and just add that absolutely top level sheen and punch and clarity that we want from our mix. The next couple of lessons we are just going to kind of up our game to the maximum level, so I will see you in the next lesson.